Hello, everybody. Good to see you again. Another beautiful week at Gwynedd Mercy. Another beautiful fall day. Hope you're enjoying yourselves. I hear that the Eagles won the other day, so some of you should be happy about that. I'm not, because the Giants stink, but oh well. But I know my context. We're near Philadelphia. Please remember that, again, Quiz 3 is online, so take it as soon as you can. By the end of the week, please. I also put up the Mr. Fiorentino. Yeah, it's good. I also put up the topic for the discussion board, so you can check that out. And the poll for Ms. Shatson. What should we call, or what should I call my coffee cup? What name should I give it? So I'm glad to see a few of you have already responded. And hopefully others will respond, and we can get see what's going to happen with that. What else? Is that about it? I think that's all. Nothing else comes to mind. The last person I'm going to talk about for Hispanic Heritage Month, and I also have to remember, like, November starts Native American Heritage Month, Ms. Noble. So stay tuned. Anyways, and here we have her. We don't have her name here. We'll have to write it on the board. Servant of God, Maria Belen Guzman Flores. Maria Belen, Mr. Trost Guzman Flores. What are her dates? 1897 to 1993. So she almost died, almost had 100 years, almost was a centenarian. 1997 to 1993. So she saw a lot of time. Interesting. She took the religious name Dominga, which might be Domenica, might be a feminine form of Dominic. Okay, that's why on this website, I guess they call her Mother Dominga. Right here, Madre Dominga. ¿Quién fue Madre Dominga? Who was Mother Dominga? Actually, I should have looked here because it has some information about her. In Spanish, but I can probably handle that. Anyways, and I don't have much to say about her because, I mean, maybe I didn't look hard enough, but I couldn't find a lot of information about her other than that she's from Puerto Rico, so she was an American. When she died, and she was a sister, as you can see, and apparently a very holy woman. She was actually a sister, not a sister, but she was the foundress of this order of nuns. No, that's why she's Dominga. The Dominican Sisters of Fatima. So that's why she's called Dominga, after St. Dominic. Okay, the Dominicans. The order of preachers. They have a male branch and then they have a female branch of nuns. So the Dominican Sisters of Fatima. And Fatima is a place in Portugal, town in Portugal where a bunch of shepherd children or poor children said that they saw a vision of the mother of Christ, Mary, and she gave them certain messages, gave them visions of hell and all. Not all of the messages were very good ones. Anyways, very concerned about the world and kind of predicting the coming of the First World War. This was in the early 1900s. And apparently there were miracles and stuff, like the sun danced around in the sky. And this was witnessed by like 30,000 people who came to see the visions happen. I don't know what happened to the sun, but they saw some astronomical oddity happen. So all sorts of weird things. Anyway, so I guess she wanted to honor Our Lady of Fatima and the visions that happened there. And so she founded the Dominican Sisters of Fatima in Puerto Rico. So I ask you, servant of, and she's at the lowest of the rung. Too bad. She seems like a nice chick, you know. Seems like a nice lady. She seems nice, you know. Praying her rosary. Looks like she's in the hospital. She's got an IV in her hand, you know. But it's a good holy woman, and I ask, you know, servant of God, Dominga Maria Flores, to pray for us. Amen. La da 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 dee. La da 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 da. Da 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 dee 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 dee. All right. There for now. Where are we? Mark the page. Oh, thank you. Mr. Musa. How's it shaking, Mr. Musa? Oh, what's going on there? Okay then. I hate it when people just decide to mess around with stuff. Whoops, that was weird. Alright then. You saw that happen, yes? That's not just me, Mr. Bean, yes. Alright, so that might not work then. Okay, so something's obviously wrong with the computer. But that's okay, because I just... the PowerPoint bigger. Do it this way. Alright. It's always something, Mr. Mulkey, you know what I'm saying? Okay, I ended here. I'm still talking about the Old Testament, the Christian Old Testament, not the Jewish Old Testament. Jewish Old Testament is different, okay? As I believe I might have said before, the Jews, the canon was not settled at the time of Jesus. It took, probably, scholars think maybe around the late 100s, there was a meeting of rabbis in Palestine, and the story is, we don't have any historical records of the meeting. The story is that's when they kind of settled on what their scriptures would be. They certainly accepted the Pentateuch. That was set by the time of Jesus. That was accepted. And some other books were accepted and recognized, like the book of Psalms and some of the prophets and stuff like that. But other books, as I might have mentioned, I just mentioned it briefly again, were problematic for the Jews. The book of Esther, which is a story of a woman named Esther, which is not even a Jewish name, pagan name, who saves her people from being destroyed. What is that, Mr. Tross? What is that? That's not chips? What kind of chips? Pringles? But what flavor? What flavor? Very nice. What's that? Oreo Deluxe? Mr. Tross, man, it's like sugar on sugar. Oreo is in the sugary drink. Like candy on top of candy, Mr. Burrito, yeah. Oh, well, you're not that good. It's not that good? No, it sounds good. But you're young, but I don't want you to end up like me. Anyways, what was I saying? Oh, Esther, yeah, she saves her people, the Jews, from destruction. They're going to be killed off on one day, and the story is she saves them. That's in a nutshell. But it never mentions God in the Hebrew version. God is never mentioned nor alluded to. So that was kind of weird. It is in the Christian version. I'll mention that in a second, but not in the Hebrew version. Then you have books like the book of Ecclesiastes, if you don't know who it was written by, which is very pessimistic about life. It's a wisdom book. And it's kind of like asking the questions, well, what is the purpose of life? It's just very pessimistic. It goes with different answers that people give, like make a lot of money, become very wise, become very religious. And all of these, the guy who wrote Ecclesiastes, just one by one kind of knocks down and embraces objection. So it's kind of pessimistic and not really hopeful. Then you got books like the Song of Songs, which is all about sex. Between a man and a woman, a bride singing to his groom, or a bride singing to her groom, and the groom singing back to her about how much they want to have sex, which kind of scandalized the rabbis. Should that be in the Bible? So explicitly erotic, So these were questions, these were books that they had to ask questions about. And they asked questions also about these books. Because these books were read by a lot of Jews, apparently, at the time of Jesus, as if they were part of the Bible. Okay? But eventually the rabbis, for whatever reason, we don't know the specific reasons, decided that no, these books should not be admitted. And what are they? Tobit, They're called the Deuterocanon, the second canon, Deuteros, yes, Deuteronomy, Deuteros, the second canon. Tobit, Judith, Esther, with additions, longer Esther, First and Second Maccabees, Book of Wisdom, the Book of Sirach, or Jesus ben Sirah, or the Wisdom of, more traditional title seems to have been the Wisdom of Sirah, of Ben Sirah, I should say, the son of Sirah. His name is not Ben, okay? It's not short for Benedict, okay? It's Ben, son of Sirah, or say Sirach, if you want to. The Book of Baruch, which actually I should have added here on the PowerPoint, I'll add it now, includes as chapter 6, the letter of Jeremiah, which really should be a separate book, because it's not originally part of the Book of Baruch, or Jeremiah. And then finally, the Book of Daniel with additions. So a longer version of the Book of Daniel with extra stories in it. Okay. So that's why you'll find in the more ancient churches, like the Roman Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Bible, the Eastern Orthodox Bible, Eastern Christians, you'll find a longer canon for the Old Testament. The New Testament is the same, but the Old Testament is longer because it represents, it's kind of like a snapshot of the early days of the canon. The Christians, because apparently Jesus and the apostles accepted the Septuagint, or certainly used it, some of the early apostles used it in their preaching, it just naturally came into use amongst Christians. That might be another reason why the Jews wanted to maybe separate out some of these books, because the Christians were using this Greek translation to try to prove that Jesus was the Messiah, and in their interpretation. So they wanted to maybe cut them off at the legs by taking out some of these books that they were using. Anyways, sometimes people think, well, because these books weren't written in Hebrew, they were in the Greek translation of the Bible. Yes, the Septuagint that I told you about, the 70 scholars, LXX. Yes, remember? You with me, Mr. Fiorentino? We're here. All right, good, sir. Anyways, and some people think that. But the problem with that argument is that we know that some of these books are actually written in Hebrew originally, because we found copies of them, or we can tell from the way the Greek is written that it's a translation. So Tobit was written in Aramaic, I believe, which is a related language to Hebrew. There are also some portions of the Bible that are written in this ancient language, Aramaic, parts of the book of Daniel and stuff. Judith is in Greek, but it was originally in Hebrew, we can tell. First Maccabees was written in Hebrew. Sirach, we found copies of Sirach in Hebrew at Jewish sites. A synagogue in Egypt had copies of Sirach, and the community. I mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yes, I mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls. No, Mr. Morita, I mentioned it in the other class, didn't I? Okay, so don't worry about it. They found some caves from an early Jewish group that was actually contemporary with Jesus. We don't think Jesus knew anything about them or had any connection to them, but they lived along the Dead Sea, their community. They had separated, they were kind of like Jewish monks and nuns. They separated themselves from the Jewish society. And we found a whole bunch of their writings in these caves. And a lot of them were scriptural writings. And we found stuff like Sirach. We found the letter of Jeremiah in Greek, interestingly enough, which is probably its original language. So Jews, even in Palestine, were reading some of these books as scriptural. And so they, how did they decide, how did the church decide? Well, it was basically tradition. I mean, the Bible doesn't shout out like, hey, I'm canonical, hey, I'm inspired, hey, it's not, you can't get it from internal evidence a lot of times. You get it from what's been what's been handed on. We get back to our old friend, sacred tradition from sources of authority. What did Jesus receive? What did the apostles receive? And we get evidence of what they received from the New Testament itself when Christian writings appear. Because most of the time when they quote the Old Testament, like in the letters of St. Paul, 2/3 of the time, so that's like 66% of the time, the Old Testament quotations come from the Septuagint. They don't come from the original Hebrew. Okay, sometimes they do, but more often than not, when Paul quotes from Scripture, he quotes from this longer Greek version, a longer Greek canon. And there are all sorts of allusions to the books of the Deuterocanon throughout the New Testament. They never quote it directly, but they do allude to some of the books of the Deuterocanon in the writings. So it was used, and it certainly was used by early Christians, the early church fathers. Again, tradition, one of the sources of tradition. Church fathers always quoted from, well, I shouldn't say always, because you always have some people that didn't, but almost always quoted and used the Septuagint. Okay, this longer version. And for Eastern Orthodox Christians, like Russian Orthodox, Bulgarian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, the Septuagint is still the basis of their Old Testament. Okay, so they just accept the Septuagint from 2,000 years ago with actually some extra books that Catholics don't accept. Like, they have one extra Psalm, Psalm 151. They have a book called the Prayer of Manasseh, which is prayer by one of the kings of Israel or Judah. They have third and fourth I think it's only third Maccabees they accept. Third book of Maccabees. And what else? What am I missing? I think there's another book out there I'm missing. Is it Psalms of Solomon? Well, anyways. But they accept all the books that were originally apparently in the Septuagint. The Catholic Church, no. The Roman Catholic Church, no. Does not accept just everything, okay, that's in the Septuagint. Which might be a question of why, you know. All right. I already mentioned that. Well, we'll move on to the... Okay, I think I'll mention this briefly. I'm not going to go over it in detail, because I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, which I could do, because I find it interesting. You can just do a whole bunch of classes just on the history of the canon and all the lists that we have. Because, Christians started making lists because, as I told you, the canon wasn't settled at the time of Jesus, and it wasn't settled for a long, long time amongst Christians. So Christians made lists of books that were acceptable for other Christians to read, and they didn't always agree about either the Old Testament, the Jewish writings, or the Christian writings. So decisions eventually had to be made. So you can see from the dates here, the longer canon of the Septuagint was generally favored in the Western Church. Rome, Spain, Gaul, ancient France, places like that, Northern Africa. In the Eastern Church, like Greece and Palestine, Turkey, they usually favor the scriptures that the Jews accepted, the shorter canon. Okay, but they didn't win the day, at least not for the ancient churches. So, for example, you see that date 382. You had a council held in Rome by the Roman Church under the direction of Pope Saint Damasus, in which they defined the canon, and it's the books that you now have in a Catholic Bible. They sent out, kind of like a letter to the surrounding bishops. These are the books that we accept in the Church of Rome. I'll skip over Augustine. I don't need Augustine. And after that, to hear the Council of Rome mentioned, that's more important because it came earlier, and it was under the direction of a pope. This man, St. Augustine of Hippo in northern Africa, held his own councils because he wanted to establish, because you had Christian groups that were challenging some of the books in the Bible that were. I think I mentioned this in the other class, Marcionism, right, Mr. Marita? I don't think I mentioned it here. We tried an early Christian heresy around the 200s of these were Christians, but they believed that. And I have to summarize. I'm giving you like the real bare bones version of their beliefs. They had a view of the world that the world was cut into twos, binaries, light and dark, good and evil, male, female, okay? And so there was a good God and a bad God, right? The good God was all good and merciful and loving, but the bad God was angry and changeable, grumpy, mean, stuff like that, unjust. And it was the bad God who actually created the world, not the good God. Because the material world is corruptible, is changeable, and God shouldn't change. God should be perfect. Anything perfect should be unchangeable. It should always be what it is. Well, since the physical world isn't like that, they reasoned, it could not have been created by the unchangeable, perfect, good God. There must be this other God who's not unchangeable, who's not good. Okay? And he created. So what are we? What are we humans then? Well, we come from the good God, actually. So we have souls. Souls come from the good God. They're good. They're imprisoned in prison of flesh, material, physical matter, our bodies. Okay, so, we deal with suffering and pain and emotions and all, and we grow and whatever and all sorts of stuff. And we die. These all come from the bad God who's imprisoned us in the bodies. So this was kind of like their worldview. When they were Christians, they claimed to be followers of Jesus, but they interpreted Jesus in this way. Okay? Their belief was that Jesus could not really be a human being. He had to only appear to be fleshly. Because if he's God, which they thought he was, he couldn't be material. He couldn't be changeable. Couldn't feel pain. He couldn't die. Couldn't suffer. So they denied that. They denied that the Son had come in the flesh, Jesus. But in the case of the Bible, which we're talking about now, they identified the Jewish God as the bad God. Because when you read the Old Testament, let's just say that the God of the Old Testament has a temper problem. you know what I'm saying? You have scenes in the Pentateuch where Moses has to talk God off the ledge from no, Yahweh, you don't want to kill off all the Israelites. I know it pissed you off again. They did something wrong, but don't kill them all off, because then what would people say? Hey, this God killed off all his followers. Go to the yearly God convention and they'll be there with Vishnu. The Buddha and the other gods, and you have to explain, hey, Yahweh, I heard that you killed off all your followers. No religion for you, no one's going to worship you. So Moses had to talk God off the ledge, So this must be the bad God and this is the God that created the world. So we get rid of all the Jewish writings, get rid of the Old Testament. But we also have to get rid of some parts of the New Testament, well, for these Christians, because some of them are too Jewish still. So the Gospel of Matthew, it's Jewish. Mark, John, they only accepted the Gospel of Luke. And then they only accepted some of the letters of St. Paul. Others they rejected, and other books, like the Book of Revelations. Because they were too imbued with Judaism. The idea of the Jewish God. They could not be from the good God, as they saw it. So the church, this is what's the context, and this is what the church had to deal with. So now there's a problem. This is, usually what happens. Now the church goes along her merry way, believing what she believes, preaching the gospel, but then someone challenges something, and now there's a problem. Because maybe the church hasn't really thought about which books should be in the scriptures. They just, here's a Bible. This is the Bible we read at our church. This is the Bible we accept at Rome. This is the Bible we accept at Alexandria. No one really sat down to think, why do we accept these particular books and not others? And should we accept them until there's a problem? So there's a problem. So that's why you have the Council of Rome. You have Augustine, St. Augustine of Hippo in northern Africa, who holds two councils as bishop. He was bishop or overseer of Hippo in the town of Hippo, but also in a city called Carthage in northern Africa, to definitively decide, and basically to propagate the Roman Church's decision. Okay? That's annoying me. To work on it later, though, with maps. Yes, Hippo and Carthage. Well, Carthage was here in modern-day Tunisia, the ancient city of Carthage, and I believe Hippo was here on the coast in Algeria, modern-day Algeria. So the longer canon prevails, because you finally have the confirmation from the Pope himself. You have the Council of Rome. The final point I want to make is you have this letter from Pope St. Innocent I, who was Pope from 401 to 417. He wrote a letter which is named by the first two words of the letter in Latin, Consulenti TV in 405, because he was sent questions from a bishop, I think in southern France, who was asking him questions about the faith. What are we supposed to believe? What should we be teaching? I think a bishop would know this, Shatson. It's like, didn't he have to take an exam or something, before they put the pointy hat on him, Anyways, but he wants certainty. So where do you go? Well, you go to Rome, with the biggest church in the area, okay? The most famous church. That's the Pope of Rome. And the Pope writes back. And one of the questions this bishop had was, what are really the books in the Bible? What can we define as the books in the Bible? And he confirms this list of the books that are in the Catholic Bible today. I told you the shorter canon was favored in the East. I'll show you an example of that in a second, but I just want to make one final point before I move away from this. Okay, yes. The list, now, this might scandalize some people, but this is just how things work, really, in the church. The church moves very slowly. It doesn't define stuff when it has to, okay? It doesn't make policies when it doesn't have to. It's passed on by tradition. Things are handed on, Ms. Kinney. And so it was not officially, the canon, was not confirmed by a church council, which is the highest level of authority, a council held by a pope. A universal council. The Council of Rome was the Council of Rome, the Diocese of Rome. But there was a universal council that was held in the city of Florence in Italy. Actually, it was held in several places, but it's oftentimes just called the Council of Florence. I have the date here. It's 14-something. 1442. And 1442, in one of the documents in the Council of Florence, they officially kind of stumbled into defining the canon of the church. So not until 1400 years later, after Christ, did the Catholic Church officially say, this is definitely it, it can't change, these are the books, whatever. You'll sometimes hear, even in reputable books, that is actually the Council of Trent that did this, which also was held in Italy, in northern Italy. That was held in the 1500s, yes? 1543, Mr. Marita, yes? 1565. And usually you'll hear that, actually, it's the Council of Trent, because it does give a list of books, but Trent is actually referring back to Florence, 1442, because there was a question about whether Florence had actually defined the books. Some of the bishops at Trent said yes, some said no, so they had a disagreement about it. So someone just sent down to Rome, I think, for the acts of the council, and someone brought them up to Trent, the written documents. So they were able to look at them and they say, oh yeah, here it is. Okay, so Florence did this first. It was an ecumenical council of the church. So we're not the first. It was in 1442. And then somewhere along the line, they lost the original acts. So we only have copies, because some bozo, probably some deacon, you know what I'm saying? Deacons. Stuffed it somewhere, put it in his satchel or something, and then forgot about it. And the original acts of the council that they got from the library in Rome are now lost to history. Thank you, gentlemen. Anyways, but we do have copies, so that's not too bad. But I just want to say this because, you will hear some, even in textbooks, books on the history of the Bible, will mention Trent and say that's absolute. It's really not. Technically, it's the Council of Florence in 1442. But still, it's a long, long time. And that's only for the Roman Church. The Eastern Orthodox churches that I've mentioned have never officially, in a council or otherwise, defined the canon of their scriptures, Old Testament or New Testament. So Eastern Orthodoxy, they just accept it as sacred tradition. It's authoritative because it's sacred tradition, and they probably don't see a need to officially define it by a council or something. So they just accept the traditional listing. But now for Protestant Christians, in the 1500s, and this is what Trent was addressing, in the 1500s, when you had the Protestant Reformation with Martin Luther and people like that maybe you've heard of, who started Protestant Christianity, they decided that we don't accept tradition. We only accept the scriptures, yes? Okay, that was their standard. The Bible alone is the only authority. So they cut out tradition. Why? Well, because tradition comes from human beings. And human beings are sinful and corrupt. And human beings can be mistaken. They can be self-involved, as I said, corrupt. They can be, not good people. And that can also corrupt the faith, And so a lot of the early Protestant reformers thought that that's what had happened, that just over time the faith got kind of perverted in a way by the sinful bishops and sinful popes and other Christians, so that it wasn't in the purity of the faith that you find in the Bible. So, we can't trust popes because they're sinful men. And, at the time of Luther, he had an argument. Some of the popes were really not great guys, and a lot of the bishops weren't great guys. Some were quite bad. So he certainly had the anecdotal evidence of his arguments. So you can't trust human beings, and councils, are made up of human beings as well, sinful men. So you can't trust the decisions of church councils, ecumenical councils. You can't trust the church fathers because, again, they're sinners. They're corrupt as well. Even if they're holy people, they're still sinners at the root of their existence. They can be wrong. So what really can we trust? Well, the only thing that we know that comes directly from God for the Protestants was the Bible. That was it. Tradition was the handing on of the beliefs about Christ by human beings. But they rejected that. That's not authoritative. So the Bible must be authoritative. Well, the canon of the Bible was decided by human beings, decided by people like, not Augustine, but Pope Damasus at Rome, Pope Innocent, who, yes, they're saints, but they're still sinners, and they're not God, so where do we look? So we can't accept even that decision. We have to go back to the original. Well, who should know what the Bible really should be? Not Christians. The Jews, right? It's their book, well, not the New Testament, but the Old Testament's their book, right? It's not the church's book from their eyes. So they thought the Jews had, Martin Luther, the early Protestant reformers, made this assumption, historical assumption, which actually was quite wrong, that the Jews actually had the original list of books that Christian church should accept, and that even Jews accepted at the time of Jesus. We know that from the story. Finding manuscripts and archaeology, it's not true, but Martin Luther didn't know that. It was an assumption. So they only accepted the shorter canon that the Jews eventually accepted, because that seemed right to them, because that comes from God. So that must be. So there hasn't really been any official, for Protestant communities, there hasn't really been any official declaration of what is the canon of Scripture. It's kind of just understood that they follow the Jewish canon and add on the New Testament to that. Of course, then there's the question of, well, where'd you get the New Testament from? Why do you accept the New Testament? That was decided by sinful men as well, by the church. Well, some of the Protestants had a problem with that too. They wanted to remove some of the books of the New Testament. Oh, actually, I guess I didn't put. That's interesting. Oh, it's the shorter one. Okay. Go on to this. Talking about the New Testament, what is the New Testament? These are the Christian writings added on to the Jewish scriptures. Again, yes, they are Jewish scriptures too, Mr. Bean, because they were written by Jews, mostly, we think. And just like the Old Testament, the New Testament has 4 sections, which are the Gospels, a short history book called the Acts of the Apostles, a bunch of letters, and finally a book called the Apocalypse, or the Revelation of John, which is a version of literature called apocalyptics, end of the world type stuff, visions and all sorts of things. So those are the 4 sections of the New Testament that were added on. Although the Gospels appear first, and they're the most important of the New Testament because they deal with Jesus, They're not the first to have been written. The letters were. Some of the letters predate the Gospels. And then we have the Gospels, and something like the Apocalypse of John is probably one of the latest writings of the New Testament. So let's start with the Gospels. What is a Gospel? Well, the Gospel is a genre of Christian literature, specifically Christian, because there isn't anything really like it, and scholars still debate what it really is, what kind of genre of literature it is, but it's a genre that contains basically the details of Jesus' ministry and teaching. So, kind of like a history, a biography of Jesus, but it's not like that because it cuts out most of his life. It focuses on the very short time frame of a few years when he ministered, when he did his stuff, and mainly focuses on his suffering, his death, and his resurrection. That's the main focus of each book. They don't care very much about what he was like as a baby or a child or a young man. It's just, they don't tell us any stories about that for the most part. So it's weird. So it's not really like an ancient biography in that way, where in the ancient world they would, start and give you all the poop, on the person, from where they were born and their family connections and what they were like, what formed them, into, say, a great leader or something, or a great philosopher or whatever they're writing about. But the Gospels don't do that. They are meant and intended to teach a message. That's it. That's what gospel means. The good message. Evangelion. Eu meaning good. Which we know in English, Mr. Robles, because we have words like euphony. Good sound. Yes. Euphoria, Mr. Chapman. Good feelings. Yes. Eugenics. Good genes. We're trying to make good genes. Okay, good. So we know this. Angelon, we know from angel. Angelion, we know from angel, which means a messenger in Greek. Someone who just brings the message or the news to people. So the good news or the good message. That's it. They're getting straight to the point. They're telling you what it is. It's the gospel about Jesus, the good message about Jesus. And they are the main focus of the New Testament. There really is only one gospel. There's one good news told for... God bless you, Ms. Tumulty, I got you. I was up until 3 a.m. working on stuff, Ms. Tumulty, I got you. Anyways, there is really only one gospel. There's one Jesus, but Jesus is told about in 4 different ways, 4 different aspects. Matthew, Mark, Luke, according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, the 4 holy gospels. Notice I say according to, okay? Because I'll say also like the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of John. But really the Greek, it's kata markon in Greek. When we have early manuscripts, when names start appearing. Whoops. I'll make that into an A. Kata markon in Greek, according to Mark. It's not the genitive, it's not the possessive. It's not evangelion to Marku, to be the genitive of Mark. It's evangelion kata markon, according to. So it's that, which is an interesting distinction, because it's not like, it's not telling you the author in a way, if you think about it, like this is by somebody, this book by Matthew W.I. Dunn, all right? It's saying it's according to Matthew W.I. Dunn, I'm a source for it. So there's a little bit of a distance here, okay? It's not implying in the title that it's necessarily directly written by this person, Mark. It's related to Mark. It's related to Matthew or Luke and John. This is their message that they preached about Jesus. Now, even though Matthew comes first, it is not the first gospel. You can see the dates there. Mark is considered to be the first to have been written, the earliest, written sometime around 65 AD, 65, 70. And then Matthew and Luke come later. They come in the 80s. And John is the latest, written about 90 to 100. How do we know this? Well, I'm not going to go into all the nuts and bolts of it, but biblical scholars a long, long time ago, and Christians recognized this a longer time ago, that, a lot of the material, or almost the whole Gospel of Mark, is actually contained in Matthew and Luke. And then Matthew and Luke add on extra stuff. So it looks, it just seems to be reasonable or more plausible that Matthew and Luke were using Mark first for their Gospels and then incorporated all sorts of new material that they had. Okay? And they copy Mark's language in a lot of places, not always. So, it's not sure whether they're actually copying Mark from a scroll of Mark or manuscript, or maybe it's just oral tradition based that's similar to Mark's. But anyways, they also tell the stories of Jesus in the same order that Mark does. They usually follow the order, which seems to be a good giveaway or a tell that they're following Mark, and how he organized the story in his own gospel. Okay, so that's why, and there are other reasons why scholars think that Matthew and Luke came later and were based on Mark. Mark was the earliest one. However, Matthew and Luke also share material that's not from Mark. They have all sorts of sayings of Jesus that they share together, which seems to be another source apart from Mark, not related to the Gospel of Mark. And scholars call this Q. Which means we don't know. In a lot of books you'll hear them say that it comes from the German word Quelle, which means source in German. So, Redensquelle, saying source, because they're all sayings of Jesus for the most part. But we really don't know. We don't even know where the term came from, who came up with it first. It's just traditional. Q. Okay, these are statements that are shared by Matthew and Luke, but are not in Mark. So these are additional. And then Matthew and Luke have their own peculiar material that they only know of. John is not based on any of these. John is off on his own. John is an artist. It's like Prince, the late Prince, Okay, the artist. Yes. May he rest in peace. He doesn't tell the same stories, and when he does share a few stories with the other Gospels, he always tells them in his own way. Okay, his view is more on like commentary, to take the sayings of Jesus and then add his own comments about who Jesus is, stuff like that. But he's very detailed, and he's, out of the four Gospels, I would say John is actually the most historical. Even though he doesn't write in an historical fashion, because he knows all sorts of very accurate details about Palestine, the city of Jerusalem, names of places, descriptions of things, weather patterns. He just knows a lot of stuff. So it's a very fascinating gospel. But sometimes it can be difficult to tease out or pick out what statements are by John and which are actually statements by Jesus, because he doesn't, they just didn't quote like we do today. They didn't have quotation marks, and they didn't. So sometimes it might be, know where the statement of Jesus ends and then John's commentary begins. Anyways, now John comes as the latest of the Gospels. All right. However, interesting enough, his is the early evidence we have for the Gospels. This little bit of papyrus you see here in the picture, Papyrus 52, dated around 125 AD, which was found. These, in Greek, are a section from the Gospel of John. So even though the Gospel of John was written later, one of those weird oddities, the earliest manuscript evidence that we have for any of the Gospels is actually John, the latest Gospel, 125. But Mark was written, we can tell that Mark was probably written before John. Anything more I want to say about that? No, I mentioned on from that. Dei Verbum. I think I mentioned Dei Verbum before, yes? I talked about Vatican II and Dei Verbum. I think I quoted from, okay. This is another quote from that document, the Dogmatic Constitution on Divine Revelation, number 18. Does anyone want to read this brief quote From Dei Verbum. Ms. Egan.
The Gospels are the heart of the Scriptures because they are the principal source for the life and teaching of the incarnate world, our Savior.
Word. Okay, yes. Jesus. Okay. Just obvious, I think. The Gospels are about Jesus specifically, his life, his ministry, his teachings. So they're the heart of the New Testament and of the whole Bible for Christians. We see even the Old Testament through the prism of the Gospels, of Jesus and his story. Okay? So they're very significant. Okay. The Acts of the Apostles I find as a history. It's written by the man called Luke, who apparently wrote the Gospel of Luke. Oh, I should come back to that. I should mention that before I forget. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Just before I forget to say it. We don't, anyway. We don't really know who wrote the Gospel. Okay, we have names, but the writers of the Gospel don't identify themselves, okay? Which usually, if you're writing histories and stuff, you would do. Usually, that typically in the ancient world, you would identify who you are and why you're writing, and maybe even identify the patron who's paying you to do the writing and stuff like that. But no, they really don't. So these are, traditional attributions. And also historical tradition tells us who they are. So according to historical tradition, which might be true, I'm saying it isn't, Matthew was one of the apostles of Jesus, one of his associates, Matthew, and John as well. John was one of the apostles of Jesus. But Mark and Luke are not. Okay, these are two Gospels by two people who, as far as we know, didn't know Jesus at all. Okay. But Mark knew St. Peter, apparently, who was one of the closest apostles of Jesus, St. Simon Peter. Luke did not. Luke knew, I think I've mentioned him before, but the man called Paul of Tarsus, yes? St. Paul, who didn't know Jesus at all, actually. But, Luke is connected with Paul. Where Luke got his information, then I don't know. The story goes that, Mark got it from St. Peter's preaching. He heard Peter preach, tell stories about Jesus, and eventually he decided he needed to write them down. Okay? Matthew and Luke, we don't know. I mean, if they were apostles of Jesus, then they were eyewitnesses, and they were just writing down the reminiscences of what they heard Jesus say and saw him do. Of course, the problem with that theory, though, is that why would they use Mark's gospel? Mark, who is not apparently a disciple of Jesus at all, wasn't one of the apostles, Why would they copy his gospel or rely on it in some way if they're eyewitnesses? So that's an argument against maybe their apostolicity. But again, we don't know. Matthew's not an uncommon name, nor is Mark, nor is Luke, nor is John. Matthew and John are Jewish names. Mark is a Latin name, but he's called John Mark. If he's John Mark, he's also Jewish. Luke that's a pagan name. That's not a Jewish name at all. And, we're only assuming that they're other people. They are the other people who are called Matthew. And so Jesus had a disciple named Matthew, not an uncommon name. He had another disciple named John, a very common name amongst Jews at the time, apparently. So they don't identify. So you can't really know. I mean, you have the historical tradition, but, there might be reasons why people might have wanted to identify the Gospels with famous people like apostles. But then again, kind of like an argument in favor of the authenticity is, well, then why would Matthew and John, okay, two apostles, yes. John apparently was pretty close to Jesus. Matthew was not really. He's not a big character in the Gospels amongst the apostles. Why not a gospel from Peter? If you wanted to make up a name and stick it on it, why not Kata Petron, according to Peter. And Mark and Luke weren't associated with Jesus. So why would you have two gospels named after people who weren't even there? All their information has to be secondhand, maybe third hand, unless it's true. Why would you make that up? So again, we have to imagine, and I wasn't there, so if I get up to the pearly gates, Ms. Goff, and I see Jesus, and Jesus is like, No. Some other guy, Shlomo, wrote the Gospel of Matthew, and this other person, and they just put these names on, or it's not the Matthew who is one of my apostles, it's some other Matthew, some other who believed in me. I'm Ms. Goff, I'm just going to be like, okay, Jesus, I got you. That's fine, I only have one question, Jesus. Where is the Indian buffet? That's all I want to know. Point me in the direction of the Indian food. And then I can hang out with the gospel writers and ask them questions. Things I didn't understand in what they wrote. Yes. So that's the thing with names, okay? You can't always identify where a writing comes from just from the writing itself. These are traditional attributions. They might be correct, and that's fine, but they might not be, and that's also fine. All right, they're still inspired writings. So this guy Luke, whoever Luke was, wrote a gospel, but he also wrote a second part to his gospels, which is called Acts of the Apostles. And Luke is more consciously an historian. All right, Luke is writing for a patron, a man named Theophilus. So apparently he's paying him money or wanted him to write down a gospel so he could have it. And so Luke writes the gospel of Jesus, and he adds to it a little history of the early church. So they should really be read together, actually. But they're separated because, they wanted to keep the Gospels with the Gospels and the history separate. But, Luke Acts. So the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, written apparently by the same person, Luke. Okay? Luke is interested in historical details very much. Doesn't always get them right, as we found out with, when I talked about where Jesus was born and when Jesus was born. But he tries to be close enough. But he tries to refer things to history, what's going on at the time. And he writes this work. And that's all I'm going to say about it. So it's a little history of the early church. Okay? An idealized portrait. Okay? How Luke thinks the church should be. He talks about, how the church moves out amongst the Jews. The Jews reject the message about Jesus. And then they move on to non-Jews to preach the message. The bulk of the New Testament is not the Gospels about Jesus, but really these letters by Paul, this man named Paul. In fact, if I have my notes, I think like 75%. Understand? I don't have it in my letter. All right, so I don't want to give a specific number because I could be wrong. But it's most of the New Testament, definitely that I know, is actually consisting of letters that were written by early Christians. Most of them by this man, Paul, who was not a follower of Jesus. In fact, he opposed Christianity. He was a rabbi who opposed Christianity, but he eventually came to believe in Jesus and founded Christian communities. The letters are older than the Gospels. We can tell from internal dating that from Paul's letters, from just people he mentions and, places he was, that he had to have been there at certain times based on historical details that we know from outside of the New Testament. So around 50 is the earliest of Paul's letters, and that would be first letter to the Thessalonians. So if you want to read the oldest Christian document that we have evidence for, read 1 Thessalonians. It's a good read. It's not too long. And there you see Greece. There's the ancient town of Thessaloniki. Still there. So he was writing to the Christian community in that city or that town. And that's our earliest, around 50. So it could be in the 40s, but whatever. So most of them are from Paul. We have some letters from other named Christians, Ms. Tumulty, like Peter the Apostle, perhaps. Probably Peter, because Peter was a very unusual name and very rare, so we're probably right that it is actually Simon Peter of the Apostles. James, which is another very common Jewish name, could be anybody. John, we have 3 letters that say they're from John, but actually never say who they're from. They're totally anonymous. It's just that people have put the name they've just assumed that it's John the Apostle, or someone called John the Elder, who was not an apostle. We don't know who he was. Another person, Jude, again, Yehuda, very common Jewish name, maybe one of the apostles, maybe. or brother of Jesus, a relative, don't know. And then we have this letter, which is really not a letter, called the Letter to the Hebrews, which is also anonymous. It's usually ascribed to St. Paul the Apostle. Maybe it was written by him, but it's anonymous. It doesn't say who wrote it. And it's not even a letter. It's actually a homily. It's a sermon. So that someone seems to have preached, and then someone thought that it was such a good sermon that they just kind of wrote a little introduction to it, as if it were a letter, and it seems like they sent it around to other people, just like you get, I don't know if people do that anymore, but you have like prayer chains, but you get like chain emails and stuff like that people send stuff around to you, like, hey, look at this article about, you hear what Donald Trump said the other day? Click on the link. So, hey, this is a really great sermon. Maybe other people would want to read it. So we'll send it around make a copy and send it around as a letter. So it becomes the letter to the Hebrews, which is really not a letter. But it's put upon, it should be separate then, right? But it's not. It's considered amongst the letters. So most of the letters are from Paul, this man St. Paul. Very important Christian figure. I'll talk about him later. But not all that glitters is gold, as they say, Mr. Morita. And some of the letters that he's written scholars think are pretty clearly from him, and then some others are questionable. I'm not sure if they're by Paul, so I give you the list here. The letter to Rome, he wrote to the city of Rome, to the church in Rome. He wrote 2 letters to a Greek church called Corinth, who were really a lot of they were partiers. They were a party church. If you wanted to drink and be merry, then you went to Corinth and hung out with the Christians there. Galatians, which is a region of Turkey, and also the Galatians were Irish. They're ancient Celts, or Celts, if you want to say that. So if you're Scottish, Irish, Welsh, there are relatives from ancient times. Galatas, Celt, Galatas, Galatia. Okay, so it's an ancient community of Celtic peoples living in Turkey who were also troublemakers, which, Ms. Murray sounds appropriate, for my people. Causing trouble, Philippi, also in Greece, the church of Philippi, a letter to the Thessalonians, actually 2 letters to the Thessalonians, but we only think 1 Thessalonians is by Paul. And then a letter not to a community at all, but to a person, a man named Philemon, returning his slave who had run away. Yes, anyways. Other letters, Ephesus is a city in Turkey, Colossae is a city in Turkey, so those are 2 letters. A second letter to Thessalonica, and then 3 letters to people, 2 to a man named Timothy and another to a man named Titus, who seem to be associates of Paul. And they all identify, each of the letters, the traditional letters, they're not anonymous. They identify the letter writers, which is Paul, but actually other people are identified with him, people like Sosthenes and sometimes Timothy. So who knows who wrote the whole letter? Maybe not Paul, but, whatever. And we know that some of his letters were written by secretaries because they named themselves, which was a common practice. You just dictated the letter to somebody and they wrote down pretty much what you said. Which is why I really, personally, I don't have a problem accepting the tradition that these are all from Paul. Because a lot of the arguments that these other letters are not from Paul, they're questionable, are based totally on language for the most part. It's just different language. He uses different language. Well, yeah, but if he used a secretary, then the secretary, one of his jobs was to clean up the grammar, add his own thoughts to clarify. So he'd use different language necessarily. And we don't know how Paul wrote, but we have the authentic letters. And we can compare them to that, okay? Well, that's assuming that Paul actually wrote them. As I just told you, in the address, Paul and other people speak. Sosthenes, Timothy, So which of those 3 maybe wrote a certain letter? And in the letter to the Romans, which almost 100% of New Testament scholars would say, definitely from Paul the Apostle, definitely St. Paul of Tarsus. Well, at the very end of the letter in chapter 16, the secretary who actually wrote it identifies himself. He says, he's greeting the people in the Church of Rome, saying hello. He says, I, Tertius, the writer of this letter, greet you. So it wasn't Paul, unless Paul had another name, Tertius. So actually, Romans was not written by Paul. It was written by Tertius, a man named Tertius, on behalf of Paul, probably just dictated to. So, I mean, that kind of, for me, blows the whole argument from language out of the water, that, it's so different in language. When we compare it to the authentic letters, well, what does that mean, authentic? Because you're assuming that Paul hand-wrote all of these. Maybe he did. Galatians, he talks about, look how large I'm writing the letters. So maybe he's right, that some of them he did handwrite. But, we know for certain that certainly Romans was not written by Paul. So I'm not so sure. I'm not going to lose any sleep over this. Mr. Fiorentino, if I get up to the pearly gates and I meet Jesus, Jesus tells me, no, the New Testament scholars were right. Ephesians, Colossians, not written by Paul at all, written by somebody in the name of Paul. You know what I'll say, Mr. Fiorentino? I'll say, that's okay, Jesus. And then what will I say, Mr. Fiorentino? Where's the Indian food? Where's the Indian food, Jesus? And hopefully Brahma, the god Brahma, is not in the way, because I'll have to push him out of the way, him and his 6 arms. Get out of the way. You're taking too many bhajis, all with those 6 arms, grabbing everything. Brahma's a grabby god, Mr. B. Grabby. Okay. The last part is the Apocalypse of John. Apocalypse simply means a revelation. Apocalypso means to take away from, so an uncovering, to reveal. Okay? So revelation. So you could also call it the Revelation of John. And the book is most commonly referred to as the Book of Revelation. Not Revelations, please. The Book of Revelation, singular. It's one book. Even though there are several revelations in the book. It's an apocalyptic, work. What does that mean? Apocalyptic works were genres of literature that were based on symbolic visions, of the... I can't see with my eyeglasses. Visions of the future, but also of the spirit world, the supernatural world. God would give the person visions. Some of them would be of the future events and stuff like that. That's what apocalyptic is. You do have apocalyptic in the Old Testament too. The book of Daniel is sometimes classified, or is classified as a version of apocalyptic, even though it's placed amongst the prophets. But technically you could say it's apocalyptic. But Revelation is definitely apocalyptic, It's written by a man named John the Elder, apparently. John the Elder, the presbyter, the priest, But his name is John, common name. We don't know if that's John the Apostle or this guy John the Elder. But anyways, he names himself as John. And he has visions. On a Sunday, he starts having visions of future events, things that are going on, For him, people, a lot of Christians, they make movies out of the Apocalypse of John and the Book of Revelation and the Antichrist and the Beast and 666 and all that good stuff. Make some nice horror movies out of it, and some not so good, but anyways. This is that Demi Moore film. What was that called? The Seventh Seal? With Demi Moore in the 90s? That was a stinker. That was bad. And stupid. The story was stupid. Anyways. You have the devil going around, or Jesus going around breaking seals. The seals, these seals that open up scrolls with the prophecies on them and causing disasters, natural disasters. And the devil's always, off to the side, doing what he does. Anyways, but the book is really not about the future. It's about, it might be, again, Miss Kinney, if I get up to the pearly gates, I see Jesus. I won't go there again, Miss Tumulty. Miss Tumulty, am I bothering you? How are you doing? Are you okay? You with me? Okay, good. What was I going to say? It's really about current events. And the whole thing about the book of the Apocalypse, and we'll learn more about this when we talk about the saints, is martyrdom. Christians were dying for their faith, for dying for being Christians. And even some of the apostles had been killed. So these were traumatic events for apparently the author of this book. And so he envisions in symbolic language, he talks about the Roman Empire killing Christians. So you have a lot of, stuff, visions where people are dying for the faith, and, he talks about martyrs, people in heaven who have been killed for Christ and stuff like that. And the beast, will be the Roman emperor who is persecuting the church and stuff like that. And we know he's talking about the Roman emperor. I don't know if I put it on this PowerPoint, I might have to. Okay. Because, the famous 666 that everyone gets all hepped up about and says is the devil and stuff like that. It's not the devil. Because if you read the book of Revelation, it tells you very clearly it's the number of a man. And the devil's not a man. The devil is an angel. A being of spiritual nature and intellect and will, but not a body. So he's not a human. So you know right there, it's not the devil. And the book of Revelation mentions the devil separately in other contexts. So it mentions the beast and the devil. So they're two separate things. It's a man. And 666, the numbers that are given that add up to 666, or the letters, I should say, because in the ancient world we didn't have the Indo-Arabic numerals that we have now. People used letters of the alphabet. That's how they did math. All right. So Roman numerals, yes. I is 1. V is 5, X is 10, stuff like that. Same thing in Hebrew, same thing in Greek. Okay, so when the person writes out the number in the book of Revelation in Greek, it adds up to 666. However, there are other manuscripts where it's a different number. It adds up to 616. All right, 616. Which isn't maybe not as cool, it's not, maybe it doesn't have that kind of evil sounding thing. 616666666, and I don't think 616, when you play stuff backwards like rock music, that you can get the same effect from it, anyways. But we know that it's spelling if you take the words in Hebrew of the name of the Emperor Nero, who was alive in the 60s and killed some of the apostles, killed Peter and Paul. Nero Caesar, the head of the Roman Empire, when you translate the letters into Hebrew, they add up to 666. That's probably not a coincidence. There are coincidences happen, but probably not, given all the other information that we have from the book of Revelation. So it's talking about the Roman Empire killing Christians, the beast of Nero who killed some of the apostles even, and that's what's going on in the book of Revelation. It might also be talking about future events that are unfolding for us, maybe because God knows more than John did, but I don't know. All right? I'll move on from this. Let's see. Maybe I'll move on, so I'm done with that. So I'll stop there. I'll see you all on Thursday. God bless you all. Have a good day. Let's see. What's going on with this? Thank you, miss. You're welcome.